Horatio Nelson, the darling child of the Royal Navy. The charismatic, vain, inspiring, arrogant, melodramatic master tactician of naval history fame. Devotees of the Napoleonic period will be familiar with the Nelsonian fanfare. The battles of Cape St. Vincent, the Nile, Copenhagen, and Trafalgar, combined with death in the moment of victory, elevating the man to the status of one of Britain's best known national heroes. But how did Britain's most famous seafarer go from being a relatively obscure officer in the Royal Navy to their most iconic leader ever? Tonight, a Napoleonic history icon of a different ilk, the much-loved naval historian Kate Jamieson, returns for the second instalment of our series on the life of Nelson. We talk about wild capers in Corsica, waving two fingers in the face of your commanding officer, balls of steel moments, and Nelson's nasty Naples controversy. This is Horatio Nelson, Rise of an Icon. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where it is time for more Nelson. I'm trying to think of another word beginning with N. That's Nelson Naval
Nonsense.
Nonsense. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. We will leave that in the final edit just to once again ram home the point of my cack-handedness on this show. Nelson Naval Nonsense returns for part two. And as you've heard already, Kate Jamieson is back in the house for this one. Who else and who better to talk us through the life of Nelson? Kate is the recently elected associate fellow of the Royal Historical Society is the correct title, isn't it?
Yeah. Great.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Master of Gunner, that's the dog. And of course, all round good egg, expert on naval history. You're going to be hearing a lot more of Kate within the realm of Napoleonic history in the years to come, quite frankly. Kate, welcome back. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for caring. We're going to get straight into the nuts and bolts of this and where we left off the story with part one, because there is a Horatio Nelson. Um, I call it something like the early story or something like that. Like, just go through the back catalogue, people. It's pretty obvious it's a Nelson episode. It literally has his name in the title. Um, but we left it not so much on a cliffhanger, but on a bit of a kind of, is this it for the guy? In the sense that we talked about his early career, and much of his early career and his rise through the ranks predates the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Just remind our listeners on where Nelson is at in that kind of time of 1789, 90, 91, 92, and why things aren't necessarily looking particularly brilliant for him.
Yeah, so Nelson at this point is on half pay back in Norfolk. Obviously, he's from Norfolk. We went through that in the first one. And he'd been writing letter after letter after letter, as we said at the end of the previous podcast, trying to get back to sea, but he was slightly out of favor. So the outbreak of war in 1793 probably couldn't have come at a better time for him, really.
Okay, so Nelson is a guy who is pleased with the fact that war returns, but in terms of getting a command, is it
Mhm.
a given that, well, war's back on, so therefore, okay, this is good, this is going to give me more opportunities, or is there still a kind of a need to lobby in order to get that command? And is there kind of jockeying for, I don't know, look, I want to command on the Agamemnon, and you're offering me some kind of sloop or something? Is that kind of the Agamemnon being a third rate 70? She was a 74
60,
Agamemnon.
64.
64. Apologies,
Yeah,
I stand corrected.
yeah,
Just the way
luckily.
you know that instantly as
Yeah,
well.
it's guns, isn't it? We're in
This
our
is true. This is true. Is there that kind of jockeying and sort of haggling and look, give me a better ship, or is it just look, just give me something, anything, I'll take it?
a bit of both, really. But Agamemnon basically got recommissioned at the end of January 1793. Obviously, kind of in anticipation of our involvement with everything that was kicking off in France. And there's that great Edward Pellew hornblower line, isn't there, about Britain declaring war on France, and a Frenchman is still a Frenchman and will beat him as we've always beaten him, which is quite Nelsonic. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it, there was a seniority certainly, but Nelson was quite lucky in that he was given the Agamemnon. He didn't know it at the time, and he had to, pull together a scratch crew and all sorts. But ended up being his favorite ship, which obviously we'll come into a little bit later.
I'm I know that the point of this episode is to talk about Nelson, but I'm interested in the Agamemnon, not least because if I remember this rightly, Agamemnon was his favorite ship.
Yeah,
Can you
absolutely.
tell us a little bit about the Agamemnon sort of build? You talk about the fact that she was recommissioned. So, is there a sort of a slight sort of victory-esque air about Agamemnon in that sort of sense of she'd been about to reach the end of her life, then the war comes along and everybody goes, "Oh well, actually, no. You know what? We need more of these rather than breaking them up. Let's just do the repairs and all the rest of it." Is that part of her story?
Yeah, so she was actually launched in 1781. She was built down at Buckler's in the New Forest, my favorite place, and it has a wonderful museum which is now dog friendly if anyone wants to go. I haven't taken Gunner yet because I suspect he'd try and pee on all of it, but it is dog friendly, so it's well worth everybody going. But they said that I think for the most part, you had thousands of people turning up at Buckler's to see the launch of these ships, and Agamemnon was one of them. I think they said there were about 3,000 people, they thought, which actually, given the fact that we've now got nice roads and cars to get there, Buckler's is actually in quite a difficult part of the New Forest to get to. Like it's not just sort of popping down the road from Southampton or something like that, it's a big thing. And the king actually tried to make it down, but didn't make it because he got stuck in Lyndhurst having some parties. Uh Pesky things in the New Forest. So anyway, yeah, she's launched. Um and she actually went off her first tour of duty, I guess, was sort of during the War of American Independence. So she was in the Channel Fleet, she goes across to America. And actually, I think one of the things that's worth mentioning about the Agamemnon is actually that she was in quite a few actions and battles um, early on. She was at the Battle of the Saints. Did we, when you talk so much about naval history, have we spoken about the Battle of the Saints previously?
We have not.
You haven't. I think it might be on our hit list, maybe. That's where it's come from.
Okay, so that'll be episode number 3,427 of the Naval series.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so she obviously then went on to be commanded by Nelson. Nelson is her captain. He joins 1793 in January, like I said. Hood chose him to command the ship. So yeah, it's quite exciting for Nelson because obviously at this point in time he didn't think Hood liked him very much, given that he wasn't being given a ship. Um, but obviously, we're heading off to war. The Navy's commissioning ships left, right, and centre. The dockyards are all busy. Everyone's spinning up. Plymouth and Portsmouth and Chatham have got people all, packing their sea chests and getting ready to head off. The impressment service are doing their own little bit. And yeah, I think that kind of ties in. So obviously Nelson's very happy that he's been given the Agamemnon by Hood because it seemed to be a good thing. She's known to be quite a quick ship. And Nelson actually recruited a lot of people from Norfolk and Suffolk. So I think it worked out in the end that almost fifth, no, 25%, 30%, something like that, of the crew were all from Norfolk and Suffolk out of 500 people. So it's a decent chunk. So they obviously, put recruiting officers all down the coast, everywhere from Newcastle to Norfolk, stuck up posters. And actually, it was quite handy for Nelson. We spoke about William Locker, his patron, his sea daddy. Uh, and he was really helpful for Nelson here because he allowed the kind of London-based recruits for the Agamemnon to be accommodated on board the Sandwich, which was his ship, until they were ready to actually go and join Agamemnon. And then Nelson also brought in quite a few sons of important people in Norfolk, reverends that he knew and whatnot. And he also crucially had on board Josiah Nesbitt, his stepson. So took him off to sea. Um, and yeah, so he's on the Agamemnon for 3.5 years, and it's really kind of probably I would say one of the most significant parts of his life because it's where he's really kind of developing his character, he's building on his experiences, he's really getting a feel for life at sea. You can read some of his letters and some logs where he's sort of asking different officers and crew what he should be doing. So at this point, he's still very much learning to some extent, but he is regularly writing to people saying how much he loves being on board the Agamemnon, and she's fast and she's, the best ship in the fleet and whatnot. Crew actually referred to her as the eggs and bacon because they didn't want to say Agamemnon, which you get quite a lot actually. So you've obviously got the Billy Ruffian, the Bellerophon, and the Polyphemus became the Polyinfamous, which I quite like. But yeah, the Agamemnon was the eggs and bacon.
Why have they got an issue with Agamemnon? Is it just that it's not a sort of inverted commas hearty British sounding word? It's got obviously those mythological kind of leanings, and they're kind of going, well, we don't know what this means. Let's just call it after what we like to eat. Is it that simple, or is there another reason underpinning it all?
Well, so a lot of people apparently just didn't like the name Agamemnon, and they said that some people probably couldn't pronounce it. So they went for the eggs and bacon. And of course, HMS Agamemnon is now going to be one of the Navy's submarines. So the name is well and truly back, which is quite nice, I think, actually.
I agree. And you talk about how he's basically raising his own crew. Why is it the captain's responsibility to raise a crew?
Well, so for the most part, you would have a ship, and Nelson's been given ships, that have the crew on board. They're already there, good to go. Nelson's replacing somebody, but he isn't replacing somebody at this point in time. He's just been given the ship because obviously she's just being commissioned for war. So he's basically got to try and bring everybody together. There's a great story as well about when they're provisioning the ship and getting all their stuff ready to go. Nelson spent £50 on port and sherry and claret for the officers' wardroom. Very important stores. Um, and of course, he bought a nice coal-fired, and radiator isn't the word I want. What is it? Brazier burner type thing to keep himself warm. Um, but yeah, he made sure that he had people that he knew previously. So there were a couple of people he'd served with on other ships that he managed to bring across. I think the purser and the bosun. He had a couple of officers he'd previously served with. He brought on quite a few young boys from the Marine Society, which I think is quite nice. Obviously, the Marine Society is now the Marine Society in Sea Cadets, so that legacy has also continued, which I think is good as well.
And where's he actually going? You say he Hood sort of selects him,
Uh-huh.
chooses Nelson. Where are they going in the world? Because the last time I gave any thought to what Hood was doing, I think of Toulon.
Mhm.
Um, has Hood been moved to another? No, Hood hasn't been moved to another station, has he? Because Toulon's 92, so the years kind of match up almost exactly.
Yeah, so he joined a division under William Hotham, and they were then joined by the rest of Hood's fleet, and they were heading down to Gibraltar. But before that, they were sort of loitering off the Scillies and Guernsey, and Nelson didn't really see the point in it, and he very much made it known and kept saying, "We haven't seen a single Frenchman. We've only been sent to sea to amuse the people of England." Um, he wasn't very happy about the fact, I think he just wanted to get out there and do something and be of some kind of use. Like I said, it was a good opportunity really for Nelson to sort of renew that friendship with Hood, because obviously it's the first time that they've met since he kind of destroyed Nelson's hopes for work beforehand. And apparently they were very civil. Nelson said that he was pretty certain they'd be good friends again because Hood wanted good officers and Nelson was one. So obviously, yeah, and by the time war broke out, obviously we didn't have one ship of the line down in the Mediterranean. We were sort of being expected to establish naval superiority, but the government weren't really seeing it the same way. Hood didn't get a lot of support. The government weren't really expecting a very long war. I think Pitt didn't even see the point at this point in time of actually deploying any British troops, definitely not towards the Mediterranean, just going to use the Navy for everything, but obviously completely misjudged that situation. It wasn't a quick war at all, was it? And all the finances kind of hinged on it being so, but it absolutely wasn't. And you've also got to take into consideration that I think from 1793 onwards, something like 80,000 British troops were killed or disabled because of diseases in the West Indies. So you've also got a huge, significant number of people out of action. So
Apologies, folks. 1793, Siege of Toulon. Brain fart there. Um,
We will get there.
yeah, we will get there. Okay, so you've got Nelson kind of sitting in the channel, kind of having a little bit of a huff. Is he glory seeking at this point? I know that's an unkind interpretation, but we know where Nelson's going to go. We know he's going to sort of do his patent bridge for boarding first rates and all the rest of it, and sort of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent and sort of telling his CEO, no, I'm doing it this way, and you can kind of make your own effort. What I'm getting at is there a direct line that we can draw between the two? You know, Nelson wants to get into the action,
Mhm.
and if so, what's the motivation for that? Is that I want to serve my country? I'm very patriotic. I've gone to sea in order to do my thing for my country,
Mhm.
just as he kind of speaks about in his moment of death. Or is this I need to make a name for myself. I don't want to be back on half pay at the end of the war. Why am I sitting here doing nothing when I've
Yeah.
got 64 cannon underneath me and I can be going and giving the French a headache?
Yeah, it's that's pretty much it, the latter. He's at this point in time, like I said, he's still not learning, he's experienced, but there's still a few bits that are quite new to him. Later engagements in the Mediterranean over the next couple of years, he's still very much kind of asking other people's advice and thoughts and how they would do things. Um, and for Hood as well, I think he was having to very much heavily rely on his officers. Um, I mean, by the time war breaks out, I guess we're allied with Austria and sort of Spain. But Austria had their own stuff going on. Spain's obviously not quite the power it used to be. They tried to increase the number of their ships. I think by 1790 they had the third largest navy in the world. The Santissima Trinidad had, of course, been launched. It's the first time we'll come across that name, but it will pop up quite a few times over the next however many hours we spend chatting about Nelson. But both of those fleets were, chronically undercrewed. They had more soldiers than seamen just on the nature of the way that they crewed their ships. And they spent a lot of time in port. So the French did a lot of recruiting kind of last minute, hoping that they could get people together to make up the numbers of the ship's complements. But they could be the most brave, patriotic people in the world, but they didn't have the competence to actually fight a ship. And Nelson went for dinner on a Spanish ship actually in 1793 and said that the Dons had very fine ships, but they're shockingly manned, unlikely to be of much use. And if any of our barge crews had got on board a first rate, they could have taken her. Um, which actually, I mean, there's actually a decent chance that if there were sufficient numbers, they probably could have. And there's also a great story about Nelson finding out that the French were putting forges in their ships to fire off hot shot. And he was like, well, that's okay. We'll just get a bit closer. So then the shot goes right through us. It doesn't really matter then if it's hot or cold. And I think that's one of our first kind of, get stuck into the action kind of I don't want to say quotes or, little anecdotes about Nelson, but he's very much just saying, right, well, we guess we'll just have to get close enough that it's not a problem. And obviously he goes on later in life to say that no captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of the enemy. So maybe a bit of foreshadowing there.
I mean, this is the second day in a row that the the Santissima Trinidad has come up in conversation. Although granted, yesterday I was in the dockyard at Portsmouth, so it was kind of relevant. Um, as you say, we'll talk about Santissima Trinidad in due course, but four gun, four deck, 130 something guns, 136.
I actually don't remember off the top of my head. That's awful, isn't it?
Okay, I have
I don't think it was
flummoxed
that many.
KJ.
I honestly don't think it was that many. I think it was when she was launched, it was about 110, something like that. It did go up. It did go up. I don't know, 136 guns sounds
Does it
about.
sound too
I don't
much?
know off the top of my head. No, not for her. No.
I am using
Probably
the ever
Trafalgar.
reliable.
By Trafalgar, she probably had.
Yeah, 130. Well, Wikipedia is obviously very reliable on these things. Um, 116 when she was a three-decker, and then of course they just decided to convert her to a four-decker, and that turned into 136 by 1802.
Yeah, because
So
there weren't that many four deck ships. The French had one, didn't they? Valmy, I think, and the Americans made one, the Pennsylvania, but that was quite some years later. So
they didn't
actually,
sail particularly well,
Trinidad,
did they? They're a bit
no,
like sort of sailing
lumbering,
buckets.
yeah, awful. Very, I mean, I guess the way to look at it is that people were viewing ships at this point in time as floating gun platforms. They weren't supposed to be comfortable or maneuverable necessarily. I mean, maneuverability is important, but a lot of it came down to how many guns you could get in, into them.
I'm still reeling from what you're saying that there are no first rates in the Med uh, at the start of the war. I mean, this is the reason that it sort of strikes me is that everybody kind of thinks of Gibraltar as being sort of one of those centers of, Britain is thinking strategically about Gibraltar and the ability to use Gibraltar as a means to project British power into the Mediterranean.
Hmm.
But if there are no first rates in the Med, presumably there's no squadron at Gibraltar. So
So
is
that's
this
why Hotham is sending a division down with Hood.
so is this kind of fixation that we think everybody has with the Mediterranean something that happens over the course of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars? Is this kind of a legacy?
Yeah, I mean, when you, well, we're going to talk about it in a minute, aren't we? When you start looking into why the Mediterranean was important and all of the different engagements that happened, you kind of get more of an idea about why the Navy were doing what they were doing over those years, why Nelson was where he was. And obviously, he was quite lucky to have ended up going there rather than across to the West Indies or something, because really it made his career.
It did indeed. So let's get Nelson there, shall we? He's been loitering off of Guernsey, making these sort of peevish comments, desperate to make himself famous. He finally sails for the Med. What happens and how does he end up in Naples?
So I think one thing I would also just mention, because it's probably worth talking about, um, sort of, I guess, summer 1793. And actually, going back to the Agamemnon, it's just reminded me Nelson was actually offered a 74 gun at this point, and he went, "No, I don't want it," because he liked A, the Agamemnon, but B, he didn't want to give up his officers. Um, and they sort of wanted to stay with him as well, which is, again, it's our we've spoken about his previous ships and people wanting to stay with him, and it's continuing on at this point in time as well. Now, obviously, 1793, Nelson is heading down to Toulon, which obviously you mentioned, which is slightly chaotic politically at that point in time, and the French Navy is divided because you've got different factions, obviously supporting different people, and Nelson's basically tasked by Hood to kind of maintain a watch, really, while Hood sends the rest of the fleet on to Genoa. We were actually letting merchant ships go in and out of Toulon and Marseille at this point in time because obviously trade was important, but it had to specifically be nothing with any French sort of cargo and also nothing that could aid the French war effort. Now that came down to individual captains' opinions as to what they decided was or wasn't aiding the French war effort. And Nelson decided that wine and linen at one point was absolutely helping to uh, aid the French. So yeah, so Toulon is chaos. You've got members of the National Convention obviously threatening to kind of take over the ports, and they actually turned to Hood asking for British protection, which is something that people don't really. I think everyone just thinks, oh, Siege of Toulon, but they don't consider the kind of the events leading up to everything that happened. And they asked for help from Hood. Hood offered it. Marseille basically fell, so they didn't really manage to do that. But Toulon was very much under British protection for a reasonable period of time. And I think the way that Hood phrased it was saying essentially that the ships were being held in trust, sort of awaiting that restoration of the monarchy, which obviously never came. Um, But yeah, Nelson, later that year, Nelson heads across to Naples, like you said. He meets the king, Ferdinand the Fourth, who was the brother of the King of Spain, and Maria Carolina, who was his queen, was the daughter of the former Empress of Austria, the sister of the current Emperor of Austria, but also of Marie Antoinette, who at this point is obviously in prison waiting for execution. So it's all very, very intertwined when you start looking into it for people that maybe aren't so aware of all of the. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on the politics of the Mediterranean, and it would go on for hours. But essentially, Ferdinand was sort of ruling the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which at this point is the largest of the Italian states. So it included Sicily and kind of the southern half of the Italian peninsula. He, despite being the king, wasn't really the person in charge. It was pretty much left to his wife and a minister called John Acton, who, whilst having been born in France, very much identified as being British. He'd been in the Navy for France and Tuscany, and then became a kind of maritime minister, and then ended up obviously helping the Queen. Now she's super intelligent. She was able to make all of these connections, and the king just couldn't really. So he was there as, the head of state by default, but she was running everything. And we were chatting before we started recording about one of the other podcasts that we did recently where we discussed Emma Hamilton in some detail. And actually, Emma Hamilton worked with the Queen quite regularly on translation of documents, on meetings, setting up meetings, all sorts of things. So she actually had quite a diplomatic role with the Queen of Naples. Now, Ferdinand basically decided that the Neapolitan Navy were going to give ships, troops to Hood and have them sort of at his disposal. But the provision here was that the security of Naples wasn't compromised in any way. And Sir William Hamilton, who is kind of the British diplomat in Naples at the time, another name that will come up a few times over the next few hours, I suppose, was taking steps to kind of organize all of these troops for Hood. So William Hamilton, just I guess we should probably cover who he was. He actually had quite an important family in himself. His mother had been a favorite of the Prince of Wales, and his father had previously been Lord of the Admiralty. He was governor of Greenwich Hospital. He was governor of Jamaica. So William Hamilton very much had an awareness of naval matters as well, which is good. He'd actually served in the army, but he didn't really like it. He went on and became an MP, didn't really like that either. And he ended up being given this sort of diplomatic position. And I think his goal really was to be given one in Vienna, and it would be a nice, safe little place to work with some good diplomatic ties and a nice life. But I don't think he minded being given Naples because he was very, very much into his kind of archaeology and classical history. And obviously there is a lot of archaeological sites and whatnot around Naples, and he spent a lot of time at places like Herculaneum. Um, and so Nelson, in his usual way, when he was writing letters, said, all of these reinforcements that were provided hastily were all down to me arriving. And actually, William Hamilton had basically done all of the work before he got there, and Nelson just went, boom, okay, it's all in motion now, perfect. Which I think is quite funny. And this is obviously also where he met Emma Hamilton for the first time. And he spent a lot of time with William Hamilton and Emma. He took Josiah, his stepson, ashore. And their house was full of art and sculptures and all sorts of archaeological interesting things for a young boy, because of William Hamilton's interest, really.
And at this point in time, nothing's going on between
No.
Horatio and Emma, right? I mean, we talked about this briefly in the Women Who Deserved Better podcast. People go and listen to it because it's eye-opening. Um, and we do get quite ranty, justifiably. But it takes a while for things to develop between Horatio and Emma. But Emma sort of ends up in time doing things like sort of almost dressing Alan Nelson, I think was the phrase that you used.
Yeah.
in the other episode. Um, so at this point in time, is there? I mean, I'm guessing there's a friendship there,
Hmm.
platonic in nature. Are there any sort of rumblings? Is William kind of looking at this, kind of going, like I'll work with you, but I'm very protective of my wife here, who is infinitely younger than me and very vibrant and outgoing and charismatic and talented, and you need to sort of stay at arm's length, or is there no sort of sense that Nelson's going to sort of try and um, ruin the Hamilton family party, as it were?
Family party. No, not so much at this point in time. They were friends, obviously. He spent a lot of time with both of them as a couple. Um, she looked up or sent quite a lot of things over for the boys on the ships. The boys came off the ships and they were taken to Herculaneum and things like that, just kind of, I don't want to say mothering, but giving them a bit of interest, I suppose, while they were there. And we don't know a lot about what was really happening at this point in time because Nelson didn't really say much about her. Um, I mean, William Hamilton must have said something to Nelson about her because when he wrote to his wife, he said that she was a young woman of amiable manners who does honour to the station to which she's raised. Because obviously she did have quite a colourful past, and that was probably the nicest thing Nelson could have said about her at that point in time. But Naples was great for him. He made new friends, people were opening their houses to him, everyone was flattering him. He pretty much got given anything he wanted. So obviously troops, ships, etc. But at this point in time, no, there's um, nothing between him and Emma beyond friendship and spending time with her husband.
Okay, so he inverted commas does his duty in Naples. The next significant moment seems to be Corsica. And I didn't realize this until having come back from being in Corsica over the summer. So he goes to he's at Bastia and Calvi. I've been to Bastia. Like the old port is very small,
Hmm.
which is really kind of eye-opening when you realize that, well, most of I mean Bastia port in itself today is not a big port by any stretch of the imagination. When you then look at what the old harbor, if you like, constituted, you kind of realize how small, so, or rather how significant very small ports end up being. So what's he doing at Bastia and Calvi? Why Corsica? Is it as simple as Paoli?
I think probably worth also mentioning, which we probably skipped over and probably shouldn't have, is the evacuation or the withdrawal from Toulon in December of 1793 is probably worth um, a brief mention. But essentially, obviously, everything leads into Corsica because by all the kind of defenses collapsing in Toulon, that kind of immediate plan of there not being a naval war east of Gibraltar had just gone out the window. And Hood got absolutely castigated for this because he hadn't really planned for a withdrawal. There were no preparations. Um, there was still obviously a decent number of French ships that hadn't been destroyed and were able to then go on to challenge us in the Mediterranean. And yeah, it kind of didn't didn't sit well for his career for actually the rest of his life. It's a bit of a shadow and a bit of a mark on his name, really. But there's a story about Nelson seeing the refugees arriving in Tuscany at Leghorn, um, which I think is probably also worth mentioning because obviously all these people have been kicked out of Toulon. There's people being murdered, families all being annihilated. He's the senior British officer at Leghorn when these first boatloads of refugees arrive. Uh, and the British consul was refusing them permission to land, essentially, which sounds quite familiar to current times. Um, and they basically just said to Nelson, "Well, if you want to do something about it, you can um, hire a ship to keep them offshore while we work out what's going on." But Nelson very much pushed to try and get them some sort of stability on shore. And eventually, I think the whoever was in charge of Tuscany, I can't remember, the Grand Duke or the Duke or something, decided to give them temporary asylum on Elba. So I think you ended up with 4,000 refugees going ashore. But obviously Toulon is probably, I mean, it was a disaster for us. It cost us a huge amount in terms of naval supremacy, and we didn't really get it back for another, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. But yeah, so on we go to Corsica after that, and I think Nelson, you've been to Corsica, I haven't, but Nelson said that it was a wonderfully fine island. So
Can I just say, I would describe Corsica as a hulking lump of granite, which
oh.
people scratch a living out of. Like it is, it's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. Particularly Bonifacio. If people ever get the opportunity, obviously go there to Ajaccio, the capital, in order to see Napoleon's, well, Maison Bonaparte, as it's known, at the place of Napoleon's birth. At which point, as you walk through it, you will go, came from nothing, my arse, Ridley Scott. Because if that counts as coming from nothing, Maison Bonaparte, then like I would love to see people who came from something, what that constitutes, because it's just
I
like
think
when
we
you
need
can.
to start doing Zach bingo for every time you mention Ridley Scott. I don't
I
think
am
we've
that
done so
predictable.
far where we've not had a go at Ridley Scott somewhere.
I don't think there has been. So what would consider this is very off topic. Like this should really belong in an off cut rather than the main episode. But I probably won't edit it out. Like there would be me having a dig at Spotify, me screwing up a sentence, me having a go at Ridley Scott, me having a dig at Napoleon, me describing Murat as all balls and no brains. Fans of the show, take to the comments section, work out what needs to appear on a Napoleonic Wars pod bingo card. Oh, rabbit holing as well. That would be in there. Um, and I don't know, maybe we'll do some kind of listen along prize thing for a future episode, but that's for planning in the future. Sorry, yes, we've got way off topics. Corsica, yeah, go to Bonifacio because it's just stunning. Go to Ajaccio for the obvious reasons. But yeah, I mean, I don't really get Bastia or Calvi. Like, so Bastia, for folks who aren't familiar with the geography, is sort of in the northeastern part of the island. It's not far actually from Elba. You can see Elba um, from the port. Calvi sort of up in the northern part, if memory serves. But if I was going to Corsica for a thing, like I would focus on Ajaccio. So why? Why Bastia?
Yeah, so obviously Bastia and Calvi pretty significant for Nelson. He's still in charge of Agamemnon at this point in time, and there was quite a bit going on with Hood, obviously, who was trying to make up for the slight blight against his name. And there was a bit of arguing going on about, the best methods for taking Bastia, but essentially the Corsicans had kind of risen up against the French, and then they wanted support from the Royal Navy. So Hood supplied a small amount of troops, which had kind of got the French out of San Fiorenzo, and then decided that they wanted Bastia because there is the large French garrison there, essentially, which had to be sorted out. So there's a really interesting, I don't know if it was a letter or I can't remember off the top of my head how it was written, but essentially Hood basically sent a message to the French chap who was in command, basically saying about all of the British positions and inviting him to surrender. And the French commander basically said, "Well, I've got hot shot for your ships, I've got bayonets for the troops, and when 2/3 of our troops are killed, I'll then trust to the generosity of the English," which is the biggest two fingers up I've heard in a while. Um,
Wow.
yeah. So obviously they had a kind of a naval led, I guess, amphibious siege, really. There's some great stories about them trying to get cannons up mountain sides. And it took about 150 people, the best part of I think about 12 hours to get this gun up a mountainside. Um, and then it didn't actually work and they ended up leaving the gun and abandoning it anyway. So it's a complete waste of time. But essentially it worked. They blockaded Bastia by sea. They had a small kind of British and Corsican, I guess, ground force that sort of took over the town. But it very much heavily relied on naval firepower, and Nelson's sort of planning for that, Hood's planning for that. The French garrison was very, very well defended, but essentially they just kept firing on them and put so much pressure on the French that after about a month they surrendered. So I mean they kept going for a really long time, but yeah, it took about a month for them to surrender. Um, and Nelson was outnumbered as well. I think there were about 3,000 French troops and 1,200 British and Corsican. But I
Okay,
mean,
so that's the Bastia story. What about Calvi?
yeah. So obviously, Bastia. I mean, you did you go to Bastia? Did you say you went to
Yeah,
Bastia?
I did. We docked at Bastia.
Yeah, so I mean, it was the blockade and the bombardment really that was the most important. I mean, if you've been, then you'll. I've really seen pictures of it. I've never actually visited, but obviously a blockade is quite easy.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you've then got ground forces kind of around the town as well, like it worked quite well. And this kind of I don't know, laid a foundation stone, if you want to put it that way, for Corsica's kind of very brief period as a British protectorate. Um, Nelson said afterwards that it was the most glorious sight that an Englishman could experience, and nobody but an Englishman could experience it because it was 4,500 Frenchmen laying down their arms. Um, and again, it just makes me think of that Pellew line from Hornblower about the French. And I know that it's not real, and I know that it's a TV series, but it is very accurate to this whole kind of period of Nelson's life, I think. So that ended May. The French surrendered in May, um, and then you get to June, sort of June to August, I guess, which is kind of the siege of Calvi. And again, it's still trying to take Corsica from French control, and Nelson is playing a pretty central role here. Um, it's the last kind of French stronghold that's sort of majorly being held. Nelson again, still on the Agamemnon, is providing that naval support. They're transporting troops all around Calvi to help those kind of British and Corsican ground troops begin the siege with General Stuart. I think it was on the army side, Charles Stuart, and he and Nelson actually got on quite well, which is rare because Nelson tends to think very little of quite a lot of people until he spends time with them. But he and Charles Stewart actually got on very well. Um, and the kind of the again naval bombardment of French defenses, you had the kind of amphibious side of it as well. But again, it was just a case of maintaining that pressure on the French and keeping it going. Now, obviously, important to mention at Calvi is Nelson's injury. Um, so probably a good time to come on to that one.
I mean, I'm not going to stop you mid-flow, Kate. Just you carry on, because there's very little that I can offer.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm just waffling on about Nelson. It's the story of my life, really, isn't it? But it was Calvi that Nelson had an eye injury. He lost the sight in his right eye. They were directing artillery fire on shore, and some flying, I guess, stone, sand in a bag essentially had been hit, and it all flung up into his face and hit him, and there was blood everywhere, and it obviously didn't look very good, but he continued fighting. Uh, and I think he very much downplayed the injury. The surgeon's mate cleaned it off and saw that half of his eyebrow had been blown away. He had a massive cut, um, and essentially he couldn't see anything out of his right eye. So he had it bandaged up briefly, and then obviously at this point in time, there's no way of really looking at an eye injury and knowing what it was or how bad it was. You couldn't go to an optician and have someone, read down a chart of naval victories as they
Is
increasingly
that an
get.
E or is it an F?
Is that a first rate or a third rate? Oh, so good rabbit
We've
holing.
started, haven't we?
Um, so yeah, he couldn't see anything. It was bandaged. He had quite a lot of pain. Um, and when he wrote back to Fanny, he just said that the eye had been cut down, but it was just the skin around it. It wasn't the eyeball. And they've said that they think looking at it from a kind of modern medical perspective, he probably had a detached retina, and some bleeding and swelling from a concussion and some nerve damage. So yeah, he didn't lose his eye. So you know where I'm going with this one, Zach. he didn't lose his eye. He could only distinguish between light and dark in the end. He didn't actually even enter the injury into the ship's log or put himself on a wounded list. And I think he said to Hood that he got a little hurt this morning, but as you can see, I'm writing very well, so it's absolutely fine. Um, and Hood was fairly certain that he was probably minimizing what was actually quite a serious injury. But yeah, so his pupil was super dilated and he was pretty much blind, but he, like I said, he could differentiate between light and dark. Um, Now, obviously, a lot of people, and I'm including the National Museum of the Royal Navy gift shop in this, think that Nelson wore an eye patch. There is a Christmas decoration that are on my sponsored ads at the moment of Horatio Nelson with a black eye patch, like some kind of ridiculous pirate. But a lot of portraits that were taken or done of Nelson at the time, there is no eye patch. Nelson doesn't mention an eye patch. No surgeons mention an eye patch after that initial bandaging for the bleeding around his eye. Um, the eye patch came in with the Victorians, and then of course that Hamilton woman where he's flouncing about in an eye patch that didn't exist. I
Have
would
we
like to
triggered you ever so slightly here, KJ?
die on this hill. Um, yeah, and I mean later in life, Emma Hamilton actually made him a little green felt shade for the brim of his hat to kind of filter the light, because he did have quite a lot of pain, and that's what they think was down to the nerve damage. But yeah, there was no eye patch.
And also, it's worth bearing in mind, like Nelson is quite a vain individual. That is not a bold statement.
No.
That is well established. And if I thought you were going to go down the Nelson didn't actually lose his eye kind of argument, but like if if anyone was going to sort of carefully curate his image in terms of, do I need an eye patch? Does that make me look better? And all the rest of it. Like Nelson would not have been adverse to wearing an eye patch, A, if it was necessary, and B, if it sort of emphasized the scale of his injury. And what is really remarkable for me about this is just how understated he's being about the whole thing, because I've got memories that are probably misremembered of reading sort of him when he loses his arm, kind of think going, oh, I've been killed and I'm about to die, and sort of woe is me, and allow me to sort of do my
Hmm?
General Wolf on the Plains of Abraham kind of moment.
Well, yeah, then at the Nile, he has a flap of skin come down over his eye, and he's all, "Oh, I'm blind, I'm done for." Um, and then obviously Tenerife. I mean, he does continue, but a left-handed admiral will never again be considered useful. And here he is writing to his wife, "'Tis but a scratch." Essentially, he is that knight from Monty Python. It's just a flesh wound. It's fine.
Okay, so that's the story of the eye. But then we have one of the sort of less great moments in the Nelson story. You've described this in the show notes as his first inverted commas mistress.
Mhm.
Talk us through this.
Yeah, so Nelson, I mean, if you read the books on Nelson's life, and here I would absolutely recommend John Sugden's volumes because they are the best. They are very heavy they are big books, they are big chunky books, but they are probably the most in-depth books on Nelson that you'll get. Um, but any book that you read on Nelson, you'll have Emma Hamilton, you'll have Frances Nisbet. There are a couple of other smaller kind of relationships or things that Nelson wanted to progress to relationships that never quite got there, one in France and one in Quebec earlier in his life, but they never really amounted to anything. But while he's in Leghorn, supposedly he begins, well, I mean, it's probably fairly certain, I guess, begins a kind of an affair with an opera singer called Adelaide Corellia. Now, a lot of the notes about this come from Thomas Fremantle's diary, and some big chunks of it were published, but the diary has subsequently now gone missing, so no one knows where that is, but big chunks of the diary were published. And he's regularly talking about dining with Nelson and his dolly. Now, dolly at this point in time is the term that they were using for a lot of the prostitutes that the officers were spending time with, which obviously did happen. It's not something that people aren't aware of, but um, Thomas Fremantle was regularly dining with Nelson and his dolly, and they had a property ashore in Leghorn. Like this is a relatively sort of long-term-ish um thing really. There's a house, he's sharing it with a woman, he's having people over for dinner. He told the English chap who was his prize agent in Leghorn that his female friend should be paid the rent for her house. Um, so yeah, there's not a lot of detail about her really, apart from the fact that she was from Genoa. George Cockburn wrote to Nelson saying about his little Adelaide in 1797. They were referring to her as Signora, so they think maybe she was a widow. But I think a lot of it mostly came out of prostitution than anything else. And at this point in time, I think I want to say it's at Greenwich, but I don't know if it's on display. There's a portrait that was made of Nelson in Leghorn in 1794. Um, it's not a very flat, it's not a very flattering portrait of Nelson. I'll find it and send it to you. But Fanny basically wanted a picture of him. So this painting was done. You can see the scars over his right eye. You can see that he's missing half an eyebrow. And she used to wear it all around her neck out as kind of a, I'm proud of my husband, etc., etc., having absolutely no awareness that at this point in time that this is being painted, he's living with a mistress who was on and off the Agamemnon all the time at dinners. Um, Nelson wrote letters to her, but I think most of them basically got destroyed when he decided to burn everything before Tenerife. But it was about 18 months, I think, they had this house in Leghorn, and it's just, yeah, Nelson and his dolly. Even Sir John Jervis wrote to him saying, "Give my compliments to La Belle Adelaide." So everyone knew about it, but no one spoke about her at home at all. And it's something that's kind of, I don't know, brushed aside in the Nelson story, but she didn't obviously have the impact on him that Emma Hamilton did by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's worth mentioning, definitely.
I was going to ask exactly that question. Does Frances ever kind of get wind of this? I suppose at some point she must have realized, but interesting that he's not being subtle about this. He is absolutely kind of parading this woman around
Dinner with
the
all of his
fleet.
officers at their house and mentioning her to other people. I mean, to the extent that people knew of it, like for
Mm.
Jervis to say, "Give my regards to Adelaide," and
But also it shows that there's a culture of this in the Navy, right? So he's doing this and nobody's batting an eyelid. And you've got somebody as senior as Jarvis kind of going, yeah, yeah, all my best to your second significant other kind of situation
But
ship
it is
going on
interesting.
there.
Um, Jervis obviously doesn't like Emma Hamilton.
Mm.
Refers to her at some point in the future as that infernal bitch, Lady Hamilton. So, um, yeah, it's interesting.
Do we have any inkling of if slash when Francis found out about this
No,
situation?
I don't know if she did. Um, I mean, people have obviously come across it from letters, um, but no, there's no real mention of it. I mean, if I suppose if you were doing it now, obviously it would be on social media, and people would do some deep dive Instagram stalking to see who Nelson's hanging out with while he's over in Leghorn. But no, she doesn't find out. She's just there wearing her nice painting of her husband around her neck because she misses him, and um, yeah.
There is a thought Nelson, Napoleon, and Murat on Instagram. Who has the most followers? I reckon Murat. Moving on though, engagements in the Med. So he's spending 18 months in the Mediterranean with his first mistress, but he's not spending 18 months just kind of sitting on his backside. So what's he doing post Corsica?
So Hood has basically asked Nelson to open up relations, I guess, with Genoa. And hilariously, the chap that he had to go and deliver a letter to about this was called Francis Drake. Not that one, obviously. But the British minister in Genoa was Francis Drake, which I always find quite funny. Obviously, this was important. Genoa was kind of between France and the other Italian states. It was politically neutral, but it was very much kind of economically with France because they owed them a lot of money. Um, so it's important to think of that. But um, I guess the main engagement, I suppose, at this point in time is the Battle of Genoa. So it's fought in the Ligurian Sea near Genoa. It was sort of a mixture of British and Austrian efforts to kind of counter that French Mediterranean expansion that they were trying on. So you had a British and Neapolitan fleet. You had Hotham again, who Nelson wasn't particularly a fan of, against a French fleet. The French were trying to escort a convoy to Corsica, um, and British scouting ships, including Agamemnon, crucially spotted them. Nelson reported this to Hotham, and the British fleet then obviously went off in pursuit. Nelson was again one of the first to engage. He actually attacked them pretty aggressively despite being outnumbered. And this is really where we start to see Nelson being the Nelson that we kind of think of. Um, he was very, very willing to take risks here as long as he could get those kind of decisive hits on the French ships. And actually, it ended up with the French delaying their plans and repositioning. But Hotham, so you on one side you've got Nelson sort of taking risks and engaging and going against the French, and you've got Hotham sort of being relatively cautious. Um, so you've kind of, yeah, I mean, you see that a lot with Nelson at Cape St. Vincent, I would say. I'm not saying he's going against plans, but Nelson is very much taking the risks that other people perhaps aren't willing to. And this is kind of the first point of this. And they managed to capture two French ships of the line, the Saira and the Censeur. And they managed to basically prevent it from escaping. The French fleet, unfortunately, they were damaged, but they managed to get back into port, so they weren't completely destroyed. But Nelson was really, really irritated with Hotham because Nelson wanted to keep going and was adamant that they could have had this really decisive victory and absolutely destroyed the French. And Hotham was obviously being super cautious, and this is kind of how pretty much the entire time in the Mediterranean went for Nelson. It was Nelson going, well, let's do this, and other. People going, well, let's just but I think at this point you're kind of seeing that growth in confidence of Nelson and those kind of strategic ideas, instincts, whatever you want to call them, sort of coming through. And it strategically, it did kind of help. They disrupted that French convoy. We had a nice British victory, and obviously it made Nelson look quite good amongst the people he was serving with. But I think this is really, really where he started to kind of gain that confidence to perhaps go against what other people thought he should be doing.
And in terms of that aggression, is that calculated aggression, or is this more sort of overzealousness, just let me at them mentality?
Yeah, absolutely. Go straight at him, as Jack Aubrey said of Nelson. Um, but yeah, pretty much. I mean, yeah, he wasn't doing it in any kind of brutally obnoxious way. Just wanted a victory.
Okie doke. And in terms of the guys who are serving under him, obviously we are pre sort of that sort of semi-mythologic mythological, that's the word I'm looking for. Um, band of brothers kind of group. But
Mhm.
you've talked earlier about how he picks where possible some of the people to serve on the Agamemnon. He's inevitably going to be sort of meeting various people, building sort of social circles. How much of a sense is there of that the early kind of whispers of the band of brothers coming together? And if there isn't really any indication of that, how do these men kind of react to Nelson and what he's like as a captain and as a contemporary to serve alongside? And do we have a strong sense of his style beginning to pay off?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we will discuss the Band of Brothers probably more in the Trafalgar covering, but it really started during this kind of period in the Mediterranean. And like we said, it's this kind of point in time is very, very crucial for Nelson's kind of leadership style, his kind of strategic instincts. He wanted close relationships with the people he was serving with. And he really worked on helping and wanting to be with those officers who kind of shared that slightly more, I guess, bolder approach to warfare. Um, and it's not just the sort of main band of brothers, it's other officers as well. You know, Nelson's relationship with Sir John Jervis is he's, you know, a mentor, but they also mutually like respect each other. Um, and Jervis, he trusted Nelson's judgment. He supported his tactics, maybe more so after Cape St. Vincent, once he'd calmed down and realized that he'd not done what he told him to. But he very much recognized things in Nelson that probably Nelson had picked up from other officers like Jervis. You've got Thomas Troubridge, who again pops up at Cape St. Vincent, um, at Trafalgar, at the Nile. I think Thomas Troubridge really was one of Nelson's closest friends, really. They served together a lot during the Mediterranean campaign. He was very reliable, he was very loyal, very, very, very supportive of Nelson. And again, all around sort of the incident at Corsica, um, and around the Mediterranean in general, he just very much took on a quite a, not self-inflicted, that's not the word I want to, like, he basically put himself in charge of some situations and showed that kind of leadership, which again put him sort of into Nelson's inner circle, I guess. Who else have you got? You've got Hood, I suppose. Um, Edward Berry's probably worth mentioning. He obviously was at Cape St. Vincent as well, and then Trafalgar. And all of these people are sort of fighting at the same time. They've all got their own skills, but Nelson picks up on a few bits from each of them. And Edward Berry actually was pretty instrumental in helping Nelson with some of his battle plans when it came to organizing the fleet in a way that kind of maximized the impact. I can't think who else you had. Henry Blackwood, Jane Austen's brother was there at one point. Francis, is that his name? I want to say Francis. Um, but it was that kind of shared, they all had the kind of shared values that Nelson had, the sort of duty and honor and courage and loyalty, but they're also all going through the same thing at the same time, right? So it's that kind of shared experiences, um, concept, with everyone kind of knowing that they can trust everyone else that they're fighting with. And I think that is probably the most important part of all of it.
Okay, so we've got sort of the early indicators there. But we talk about sort of somebody who sort of seems to follow Nelson through the early phase of his career, and that's Josiah Nesbitt. He's come up a couple of times in this episode already. Of course, Nelson's stepson, the son of Francis. What happens to him over the course of all of this? Is there a point where he sort of gets pushed to the side, or does association with Nelson enable his career to take off a bit? What's the story?
Yeah, so in the same way that Nelson went off to sea with his uncle quite young, Nelson took Josiah to sea with him when he was 12, in the Agamemnon as a captain's servant. Basically, he ended up at Santa Cruz, obviously, with Nelson, which we will cover very shortly. But Josiah essentially saved Nelson's life. He put a tourniquet on his arm, got him back in a boat, got him back to the ship. Um, and Nelson really was obviously very, very grateful for this, but his patronage really, really helped him get promotion quickly. He ended up um, in command of a frigate, I think. But it transpires that after the whole Emma Hamilton affair, he he was, well, he was arrogant. He was very, very rude. He was drunk a lot. He resented Nelson hugely because obviously he'd built Nelson up in his head as his stepfather and this naval hero and all this kind of stuff. And he'd really helped him out. Um, but he left, yeah, well, he didn't have anything to do with Nelson. And it kind of left him out on the fringes a little bit. He wasn't given a command. And he pretty much left the Navy. I think he was like 21, 22 when he left the Navy. So he didn't have a huge career. And then he went on and became businessman. And so Francis Nisbet is buried down near Exmouth in Littleham, in the churchyard down there. And there's a memorial plaque in the church for Josiah as well, who is um, buried there too. So I guess, yeah, it doesn't go very well well, it probably would have gone better for him, but he just didn't want to accept what Nelson had done to his mum, which is fair enough, I guess.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
I
think we
can,
can
you
safely
can
say that.
spent your whole, well, from the age of 12 serving with this person, seeing them as this great figure that you've probably put on a pedestal because you're a 12-year-old and you're very impressionable, to then having to cut them off almost completely because, well, he's a bit of a shit. Um, it's a shame, really. So yeah, no greatness for Josiah particularly.
Okay, so we're approaching Cape St. Vincent. I'd say this with one eye on the time, which we're probably going to leave things at Cape St. Vincent.
That's probably wise. We've we've got so much else to cover, so much more to cover.
Okay, so we'll cover Tenerife and well, not really much on Nile because we did a whole episode on that, and Naples in um part what will be part three of the Nelson story. But we absolutely need to talk briefly about Cape St. Vincent, not in huge detail because we'll do an entire episode dedicated to that and um the wider context of the battle. But this is, to my mind, where we see Nelson really begin to ascend into the popular consciousness. Now, maybe that's just sort of misconception from me, but I'm particularly thinking of that comment about, Nelson's patent bridge for boarding first rates, the imagery that's produced off the back of this. So talk us through what happens and quite why Nelson seems to go, look, mate, you might be my CO. You might have your plan for this battle, but I'm not hanging around. Like I'm going and doing my thing. Are you coming? Yes, no, I don't really care. Like I see French people, I go take ship, I go get fame. Is a obviously a sort of facetious way of characterizing what Nelson does. Is it also an accurate way of characterizing what Nelson does?
I mean, yeah, fairly. Uh, it's Cape St. Vincent where he really starts becoming that PR machine we know him to become. Um, and he basically spends all of the time afterwards telling everyone what he's got up to. So yeah, I would say that's a fair synopsis of how Nelson goes through this.
Okay, so what actually happens?
What did actually happen? So at this point, Nelson's promoted to Commodore in 1796. Um, Cape St. Vincent is in February 1797 on Valentine's Day, in fact. Um, and essentially, he's off to join Sir John Jervis off Cape St. Vincent. There's a really thick fog. They come across the British fleet. He's joined them on, I think he managed to link up with them on about February the 13th, February the 12th, something like that. And Nelson had told Jervis that the Spanish were approaching essentially. So Jervis was making all his preparations, etc. Nelson moved over his Commodore's pennant from Minerve. He's not with Agamemnon anymore at this point, across to HMS Captain, which I think is a great ship name. And Jervis very much was aware that, it wasn't really going how everyone had thought it would be. And Britain really needed a victory at this point in time, and morale was low. If the Spanish had managed to reach Brest and join up with the French, because obviously we don't like Spain at this point in time either, then that's a huge threat to England's defences. And also the winter before, so I guess November, December, January, sort of that 1796, 1797 crossover, the weather had been absolutely honking, and loads of ships had been damaged, and it just wasn't a very good place to be. So he wanted this really, really decisive victory. So Jervis, um, there's a great story about how his signal lieutenant had said upon seeing all the Spanish ships, including the Santissima Trinidad, by God, they're thumpers, which isn't particularly what you want to be hearing. Because obviously you've got this massive four-deck ship supported by six other, three-deckers. Like they are big, big ships. And there's a great story about how his signal lieutenant was, saying there are eight sail of the line, Sir John. Very well, there are 20 sail of the line, Sir John. Yeah, okay, there are 25 sail of the line, so you can see where this is going. There are 27 sail of the line, Sir John. And at this point, Jervis just says, yeah, enough, no more of that. The die's cast. If there are 50, I'll go straight through them. Um, and again, that I think, you know, you can link that with Nelson. Nelson took a lot from Jervis. Um, so the Spanish were in a couple of divisions. Um, and at about, I guess, 11 in the morning, Jervis wanted them to form line ahead and astern of HMS Victory, as convenient. Now, the plan that he had wasn't actually that dissimilar to what Nelson did at Trafalgar 8 years later. Again, going sort of straight towards the fleet and trying to break them. And it wasn't the first time it had been done. Nelson wasn't the first one to do it. It had been used sort of at Cape St. Vincent, in a loose way, but also at both the Saints and the Glorious 1st of June. So you've got Troubridge, our chap we were talking about, Nelson's bestie, um, down at the front of the line. Nelson's sort of third from the rear. And Jervis signalled for them to engage the enemy more closely. He was going to pass through the line. Troubridge went for this gap between the two Spanish divisions and kind of cut off the 9 ships at the head. And as the rest of the fleet joined him, he decided to open fire alongside all of the ships behind him, which had all unfortunately double-shotted their guns for that first broadside, which is pleasant. And there's a great line by Jervis where he's saying, "Look at Troubridge there. He taxes his ship in battle as if the eyes of England are upon him." And he said that he wished they were, because they would see him for what Jervis knew him to be, and what the Dons, the Spanish, would very soon feel him to be. Um, and the Spanish were struggling. As I said, they didn't have very skilled crews at this point in time. I think there's a story about the Santissima Trinidad having maybe 100 people who knew what they were doing out of a crew of about 900, which isn't great, statistically. And it didn't really get much better by Trafalgar. It did improve slightly, but not a huge amount. So yeah, the British are engaging the Spanish, and they're going up and down the line firing. Um, and it was at this kind of point where they realized that the plan wasn't particularly working, and Nelson had realized that the fleet would soon be chasing the Spanish, but by the time they'd sort of tacked and brought the ships round, the Spanish would then be breaking their own line. So he decided to take it upon himself to swing his ship to port, cut through his own line, went straight in front of Collingwood over on the Excellent, straight for the van of the Spanish division, and took on the Santissima Trinidad. Nobody went with him for this one, obviously. And so Victory at this point is taking on a Spanish ship. Goliath was helping them, and there's a great story which I love because it's from one of the gunners, and we all know I love a gunner, saying that they were giving the Spanish their Valentine in style. Um, yeah, there's always a gunner. There's always a gunner. So yeah, Collingwood's engaging the Spanish, and they struck their colours and surrendered to him, and then he went off to help Nelson. So at this point, Captain is absolutely battered. Um, she's had damage to her mast. She's got damaged sails. Nelson had been knocked off his feet by a lump of wood, and I think they said later he actually had kind of a hernia from that incident. The problems that he was having, they said, were likely to have been a hernia that was caused by that incident. But anyway, so Nelson's on captain. She's dismasted at this point. He goes alongside one of the Spanish ships, the San Nicolas, heads across with a boarding party, which again is quite impressive given that he's just had a massive stomach injury. And the captain of the ship basically offered to lead the boarding party, and Nelson said, "No, no, I should have the honor of boarding first." So, so Nelson, so
It is,
Nelson.
isn't it? It's like, what do you think you're doing? You're
Sorry.
not taking all of the glory, man. It's my turn.
Yeah, and so he famously jumped on board shouting Westminster Abbey or glorious victory, because obviously at that point, if you were going to die, you were going to be buried probably in Westminster Abbey. Nelson actually didn't want to be buried in Westminster Abbey. He wanted to go to St. Paul's Cathedral, but we'll come we'll come to that later. The San Joseph basically came to help the San Nicolas, and then Nelson decided to cross deck to the other ship, so from the San Nicolas to the San Joseph, and this became known as Nelson's patent bridge for boarding first rates. And by sort of mid-afternoon, he'd basically forced both ships to surrender. So he went back to his ship, and the time the battle finished, maybe like 4:30, 5 o'clock, it was over. The Spanish decided to head back to Cadiz, and everyone was sort of ordered to tow HMS Captain because she was not in a good way, um, and go off. And Nelson went over and had a chat with Jervis, and in his very modest Nelsonic way said that the Admiral embraced me and couldn't sufficiently thank me and used every possible kind expression which couldn't fail to make me happy. Um, yeah, it's Nelson being Nelson is what we've got here. And Jervis wrote back his dispatches after the battle, but didn't really say anything about what Nelson had got up to. And Nelson was very adamant that he wanted everyone to know what he'd done. And like I said, his PR machine was kind of going into full throttle here. There was a recipe going around for Commodore Nelson's olla podrida, which was a recipe. And I mean, the first line of it was that you should take a Spanish first rate and an 80-gun ship. After well battering and basting them for an hour, keep throwing in your force balls and be sure to let these well seasoned. And it was a long old thing. And Nelson had copies made and sent them home, as well as his own account of the battle, which he sent back to everybody he knew in the hopes that it would then make it into the newspapers and everybody knew what he was getting up to. Um, I mean, yeah, so the Spanish didn't manage to go and join the French. They ended up stuck in Cadiz, being blockaded again by Jervis. But yeah, I think it was 15 ships of the line on our side and 27 for the Spanish. So very, very much outnumbered, almost 2-1, really. But yeah, it went quite well for them. Jervis became Earl St. Vincent because obviously Cape St. Vincent, logical. Some other officers were made barons or baronets, and Nelson got made Companion of the Bath. He turned down becoming a baronet because he didn't have enough money to actually manage to live in the way that he would be required to socialize and things. And the poor Spanish chap, Cordoba, actually got arrested and kicked out of the Spanish Navy, and most of his captains faced a court martial. So we'll go into more detail on that when we cover Cape St. Vincent in full. But it is interesting, and it's really where Nelson's kind of self-promotion, self-publicity kicks in, but also where you've really seen that confidence that he kind of gained at Genoa over the sort of 2 years since. It's obviously ramped up, and he's happy to make those decisions. He doesn't need to confer with other people. He just makes the decision and goes for it. And that's really where you see that for the first time.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that actual meeting where Nelson claims he was embraced and flattered and thanked endlessly by Jarvis, because I strongly suspect that the response might have been a tad more robust. What were you thinking?
Yeah.
Might have sort of crossed Jarvis's mind at multiple points. And also, what the hell have you done to the captain? The ship, not the captain of the captain. Although having the ability to say "I am the captain of the captain" is I agree with you. Is like
Like
just
a
cool.
oh, what's it? HMS Pinafore. It sounds like some kind of lyric from an HMS Pinafore song or something. I'm the captain of the Queen's Navy.
We will inevitably dive into the fallout of Cape St. Vincent in more depth on the next one, and of course, when we do a dedicated Cape St. Vincent episode. But Kate, thank you so much for your time. Kate Jamieson there, recently elected associate fellow of the Royal Historical Society, all-round good egg, expert on Nelsonian naval nonsense, as we're calling this series. Kate, thank you so much for your time, and look
Thank
forward to welcoming you back on the show very soon. Merry Christmas, folks. If you'd like to spread the festive cheer this evening, you know what I'm about to say. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Normally, when you listen to these, please, you're likely to be on the commute, so can't act on them, especially if you're in the car. and then you perhaps promptly forget. But if you're tuning in over the break, there is a chance you could actually do it right now. It'll take you a few seconds. And if all of our listeners did it, we'd be one of the top rated podcasts in Europe. If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.